Okay, and
I'm a visual person.
yes. Well, you're counting that I am too. So the session today is going to be assessment as empowerment. And our feature presenter is Jimmy Pye from the Ottawa Carleton School District out in Ottawa. I first met Jimmy 8 years ago at the same conference that Mike and Susan were at as well. Canadian Math Education Forum in Ottawa. Jimmy has been teaching in Ontario for about 12 years. He's a regional representative for OAME. OAME is like the Ontario equivalent of BCMT, except they have chapters all across the province, and sometimes they're geographic, but they have chapters for sort of affinity groups, like private schools have their own chapter and things like that. And he's chapter of the 034ME, which is the Ottawa region one. And he's the grade 7 to 12 director for OAME on their executive. Very passionate about assessment. The thing I know about Jimmy, and Jimmy, you did your master's with Chris Sertam out of the University of Ottawa on assessment.
That's right.
Yeah. Anybody who works in assessment anywhere in the world knows Chris Sertam's name. And Jimmy, really fortunate to be working with someone who is such a forward thinker when it comes to assessment, specifically in math education. To have those two things come together is amazing. So without further ado, I give you Jimmy Pye.
All right, so let me just share the screen here. So yes, thanks Peter for his intro and for this invitation. This talk is a little bit different for me, I think, because since usually when I facilitate workshops, I try to surface as much of the participant conversations as possible. So in that way, it's actually quite rare that I would talk a whole lot during a session. And I think this really ties to my attitude and beliefs about effective professional development, which in a way is similar to effective learning in the classroom, that it needs to be generative, collaborative, and deeply personal. So in contrast to that, what I'm going to do in this session is to mainly talk, at least in the beginning parts. So we'll see how it goes. Because I do live in downtown Ottawa, so I have front row seating to all of the mayhem. And so hopefully I'll stay coherent with my lack of sleep. So I'm hoping to share my experiences, thoughts, and questions. My hope is that some of what I said will be provocative, challenging, food for thought. Since today I will eventually be talking about power and identity, and truly, like, when are we not talking about power and identity? I think it's more important to recognize that I'm living, breathing, and learning on unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation here on Turtle Island. I'm going to begin by telling you a little bit of my journey with assessment. As Peter said, I'm very fortunate to have worked with great thinkers in assessment, Chris Sertam being a really big aspect of that, what I will talk about in a bit. But first, I think there's something you need to know about me is that I'm really just like always hungry. I'm really always really unsatisfied and hungry for more. And I'm always asking a ton of questions of myself and of others. And that really captures a lot of me. And I don't always ask it out loud because it's rude. But I'm always asking questions in my head and answering them too. But yeah, questions. About 12 or 13 years ago, as I started teaching, I knew that for me, group work, collaboration, rich tasks were all non-starters. But of course, these were all actions that really required disambiguating. And because I was really relentless at asking myself and others these questions, I sought out people and ideas. And so when I stepped into the first course I was teaching, I had several ideas that I was attempting alongside teaching the curriculum. And over time, they evolved to things like sequencing curriculum concepts, spiraling naturally through the curriculum, through multi-day activities. I think some of the later interpretations of spiraling sometimes sort of lost this notion of naturally and hops between topics without something to ground them. Here's an example of a series of activity I did in 2015. Let me just throw up a chat here. So where here is I took the idea about Lego images and you know, not super out of the ordinary. There has been other ones around, but what I did that was slightly different was that I harnessed the kinds of questions that students would ask about the images and then sort of unpack these questions over time. In the beginning, allowing that time for and space for students to discuss items like gender norms or commercialism and so on and so forth. And then throughout the 9 days of this activity, we would actually touch upon a large variety of topics in the curriculum. And all driven by sort of student questions too. Another thing that I was thinking about at the time was alternative forms of assessment as an aspect of getting where students are at through triangulation. And I was really wrestling with the idea that the collection, interpretation, and use of data need to be natural, opportunistic, and individually different. And then the next thing that I was sort of front of mind was somehow incorporating mathematical processes, which I believe you call them competencies in BC, alongside these sort of more content-oriented expectations. So how best to do this? What is effective? What does effective even mean? This image here was developed in 2006, so a few years before I started teaching. And it attempts to show sort of the interrelatedness of competencies and curricular content. In any case, so I was doing these different things earlier on, and it wasn't like I felt like everything was perfect, but for the most part, I had an idea as to what I needed to work on. I was also one of the earlier users of Twitter. Here's an image of the older logo of Twitter and then the current one. So I got connected to a bunch of people there and then was constantly thinking about the structure of a task, nuances of what makes a task rich, how to incorporate manipulatives, how to do group work, how to consolidate, how to engage, so on and so forth. I ended up working on a lot of different skills back then, pretty much tried new things every class and sometimes even changing directions in the middle of the same class. And I even worked on skills that I didn't even think I would ever wade into, like, for example, taking videos and editing videos. This example here was when I was creating stickies on the wall. I don't know if it's displaying properly as a GIF. That made the shape of Mario eventually. This is just the beginning, is more like the hook, I suppose. And then when I play them, so what the students would come in and they would see this giant display of Mario and Pikachu and then start talking about it right away. And then I would play them the video with a time stamp on it, because that's what the clock was for, I guess. And then they were then invited to ask questions, and then we spent several days unpacking their questions, which is similar to the Lego example that I shared. So for the most part, I still had wonderings and questions that I was exploring, but I felt all right in general. Like I felt like I was on a path that was productive. And of course, about 2 years later than that, while presenting at CMEF back in 2014, like Peter said, about how to leverage our surroundings, circumstances to engage students, and following questions that students generate. So kind of similar to what I was just describing. There, I met Peter. And so his work on the thinking classroom has also really shifted my students' experiences since then. So in any case, as I was saying, I felt at the time that I was on a productive path. Except for assessment, or at least what I defined to be assessment at the time. Like, sure, I had been working on triangulation and standard-based grading, but it kind of all felt fake and forced. So at the end of the first or second year I was teaching, I did two things. First, I joined this summer writing team at our board, and also for several years after that, until the funding ended, called the Math Evaluation Program, that worked together to design assessment strategies for math teachers in our board. Well, actually on paper, they primarily focused on standardized exams and summative tasks, because more money for standardization and attempts and measurements. But regardless, I spent a lot of time making trouble challenging ideas, talking with folks about rubrics, competencies, the idea of no zeros for a homework, which had been a new-ish policy when I entered our board, standard-based grading, and so on and so forth. We wrestle with a bunch of questions like, what does level 1 look like? What is level 4 if level 3 is supposed to be the provincial standard? How do we integrate and evaluate the mathematical processes? How does group work come into play with assessment, and so on and so forth? It was also at about this time that I developed a visual evidence record based on what folks were doing on paper. I initially created this on Excel, which is the version that is shown in this picture here. And is also one that I sort of discussed in this blog post back in 2013. But then quickly I transitioned to Google Spreadsheet, primarily for its ability to be shared with students at all times. And I also used the extension Doctopus to help me create duplicates and distribute automatically to my students, so I don't have to painfully make every single one. And so here is another post from 2015 where I wrote a little bit about that. And I mean, my blog is mostly defunct now, so it's more of an archive, and I haven't really written anything for a really long time, nothing really substantial anyway, which is a bit similar to my own exit from Twitter, but that's like a separate story. So that was the first thing I did, thinking about assessment with teachers at my board who were voluntarily thinking about assessment. The second thing, as Peter alluded to, is that I also began working on a master's degree with a focus on observations and conversations. And as a result of thinking about assessment in this way, and working with Chris Sertan was definitely a privilege. And about 200 pages of thesis, and 6 years later, I found that I really had fundamentally changed how I was thinking about assessment. First and foremost, I was really no longer equating evaluation with assessment. In fact, I saw assessment as an ongoing process. And those of you that are really interested in assessment would know this. Eliciting, attending, interpreting, and responding to student thinking. Just to be brief, there's a lot to unpack here, but eliciting and attending relates to establishing the conditions for, and subsequently noticing or paying attention to what the students are doing or talking about. Interpreting means that we are thinking carefully about what the students are saying and doing, and then making inferences about what they mean to say or do, or maybe understand, maybe. And then responding to student thinking is what we do with this information. Do we listen some more? Do we offer some hints or prompts? Do we say nothing and walk away? So in this sense, assessment to me is sort of everything that we do that relate to students. I saw functions of assessment, which I identified as formative, summative, and I did add interpersonal or relational. And I saw these functions as not inherent characteristics of any assessments, which I'm including as more than just, of course, individual events or occurrences, and certainly can be more than just written evaluations. These functions are not inherent characteristics, but instead can only be determined after it has served a function, what I call retrospectively. So this fluidity or resultant fluidity, it means that I can have a conversation with students, or they might be having conversations with their peers, and I'm privileged enough to capture some of that, which may begin by serving some formative functions. But then it may also serve summative functions if there's a demonstration of learning that there is an improvement on the existing data that I had of the students. So in that case, it would also serve summative functions. This is in contrast to, say, a student who had written an evaluation and was unable to really demonstrate the extent of their learning. But if that piece of paper is subsequently used in conversations and reflections in a way that supports their next step forward, then it would also serve formative functions. I also saw assessment as being influenced by several factors, which I categorized to 4 domains of influence: teacher-student relationship and context. And actually, some of my realizations here led me to decide to move schools fairly often early on. So throughout my time of now almost about 13 years, I've worked at 4 or 5 different schools, each with a very different student demographic. For example, when Peter was able to visit me, I was at a school that was a site for refugees and ELLs and ELDs. So different student demographic, but also different department culture and attitudes towards mathematics, assessment, and education, and then which forces me to have to navigate all of that. In any case, I want to say a little bit more specifically on the domain of teacher and student here. With both the domains of teacher and student, I described identities, resources, and orientation as aspects of that. So identities as in beliefs about themselves, about mathematics teaching and learning, and about assessment. Resources, so knowledge and lived experiences of mathematics, pedagogy, assessment, curriculum. But also at the same time, you also need to have knowledge about students and about student experiences. And then orientation is where I clump together things like frames of mind, ways of noticing and listening and attending. And I'll talk a little bit about frame of mind a bit later as well. But really, the main thing I learned through these processes and a journey so far is really assessment as a process that is ongoing, contextual, and most importantly, it's human. So let me say a bit more about what this means. So first, that there will always be a bit of incoherence and incompatibility here. And I think that's sort of inherent in what we are doing as soon as we're talking about measurement of human understanding. It's trying to do something quantitative to something that is qualitative in nature. So this is a quote that I really like from York, who said, summative assessments of complex achievements are almost always judgments and not measurements. The use of finely graded scales tends to seduce assessors into believing that assessment can be conducted with a precision which it manifestly does not possess. Second, efforts of formalization I found can actually change the process that we and the students are engaging in. So for example, having a checklist in front of the student while they're engaged in conversations will often change their interactions with each other and with you, whether it's content of what they say or maybe the register or anything like that. And in a sort of similar way, like taking pictures of their work will also similarly have an impact on how they do what they do and how they think what they think. So next, the fluidity that I mentioned earlier across functions, I think is really important. When exactly does judgment begin and feedback end? Can we really realistically answer that? Like, really? I don't think we can readily identify this with every single aspect of the assessment process. And finally, that coherence is key, which is, a little juxtaposition with incoherence earlier on. But this coherence is more a coherence of what we can make out of what we have. So even if each piece of the puzzle or the way that we obtain the puzzle doesn't make sense on their own, what we try to paint together as a picture must be coherent with each other. So this is where I sort of slide on a new lens as we talk about power. So power. I've actually have been talking about power all along. Assessment is inherently power-laden. Influenced by power, constructed out of power, perpetuates power, embedded within systems of power, and so on. This idea is almost self-explanatory, but I'm going to try to dig into some of the specific examples by revisiting some of the ideas from before and then interrogate these circumstances and practices a little bit. Specifically, I'm actually just going to pose a whole bunch of questions, which I invite you to think about. there has been the paradigm shift. This is mentioned quite often in how we think about knowledge, education, teaching, and learning. Instead of a lecture-based situation where students are expected to robotically repeat and absorb, we recognize that students are constructing their understanding, and that this is the case even without us recognizing it. Triangulation, then, if it's a natural process, only kind of makes sense in the context of spaces where students are talking, thinking, and doing mathematics. I mean, what is there to observe if students are just thinking, or sorry, sitting and listening and waiting to be told what to do? So there is already a sort of shift of power in this sense, since students are now active participants. They are explicitly seen as creators of their own understanding. But wait, remember how I mentioned earlier that I was always hungry for more? There's more things to consider when it comes to power and triangulation. For example, who is entering whose space during observation, conversation, and product? I mentioned earlier that having a checklist in front of a student while they engage in conversations can change their interactions, but really more than that, just sort of stepping into their world, I found, when they're engaging in rich conversations and activities, brings a dimension of power that would be different if you weren't there. So, and in a place with knowledge mobility and physical mobility, that fluidity also changes the power dynamic. So how are student peer interactions influenced by group dynamics? How do student identities, in terms of how they perceive themselves or how they think others perceive them, how do those impact what they say, think, or do? All of these questions and responses to these questions subsequently impact triangulation. Some of these have to do with this positive culture that we co-create and continue to maintain throughout the year. And some of it has to do with perhaps minimizing or acknowledging your presence or the way that you step into a space of a group. But another thing about this, thinking about triangulation as a starting place, is that there's yet another consideration of power. To triangulate is a verb. It implies that someone is doing the triangulating. So inherently, power still lies with the teacher. It's not something we can shake off, nor is it something that we want to get rid of. We just have to really keep in mind that, with great power comes great responsibility. And whether you attribute that line to, Spider-Man's Uncle Ben or Voltaire is, I suppose, like a separate discussion about power. Evidence record is next one up. So the existence of something like the evidence record, well, that's a little faded, can also be thought of as a way to empower students, especially the version where students have ready and consistent access to them that they can leverage to power their next steps. But here we still sort of encounter a similar struggle with power. What information counts enough to be gathered? Is there a threshold that needs to be hit? Or is absolutely everything being gathered? When is the information being gathered? And this when being a reference to relative time. So in a student's timeline, where a snapshot is taken. We're all in a system where we have sort of batches of students that go through and being labeled primarily by their date of manufacture. But really, realistically, we all have differences in how we engage with various kinds of thinking, and there's nothing wrong with that. Who is doing the gathering of information? And here I mean the who by students, peer, teachers, but also the different like us. So is it the Monday Jimmy gathering information after a restful weekend? Or maybe the Jimmy that has endured, what's happening downtown Ottawa because he lives here. Most of that information, that data will still need to filter through us. It is considered to be data by us. And this in a way is because we have certain expertise about the subject, connections across the concepts and so on. But at the same time, we would not necessarily have expertise in, say, student circumstance, their lived experiences, and just how specifically they think about particular ideas. After all, if we were mind readers and we instantly understand the minds that we've read, then assessment would be a different ball game. Other things to consider though are just what purposes are served by the evidence record and how are the gathered information considered together in something like reporting. Really, ultimately though, evidence records cannot be the end. Otherwise, it's still just a relic of teacher power, a sort of fancy, disaggregated way of telling students that where they are based on teacher judgment. Student access to this is one step, but these need to serve conversations with directions toward improvement. So in my circumstances, we would, for example, have repeated natural opportunities through spiraling to engage with particular standards over time. But there's also another consideration of support though, because I mentioned earlier that there has been a paradigm shift. I mean, that's a very broad stroke description worded in research from like observers of teacher practice. But realistically though, besides a paradigm shift in how we as teachers see assessment, we also need to support a shift for our students and their communities in how they see mathematics, how they see education, and how they see assessment. Co-construction is also fundamentally about power, whether it's co-construction of what understanding looks like or what competency looks like. In a way, it's about bringing students to the table to work together on improving their understanding. But who built the table? What is the table for? What exactly is our basis for measurement of quality? What is deemed important or worthwhile? How much space do we occupy in this co-construction? Is it truly a co-creation? I sort of entered in this profession, I think, really needing the student doings to be rich. Otherwise, to me, there really isn't a value in institutional education. I tend to think that isn't necessarily the task alone that makes the student experience a rich one, that there are many other factors at play. At the same time, we can think of mathematics as being about structures, relationships, and patterns. And these structures, relationships, and patterns can be overlaid on anything. As you know, Gutstein have alluded to. As an aside, when I attended the previous ECME in 2016 in Hamburg, which is another time where I fortunately had a chance to chat with Peter a little bit more, Deborah Ball posed this question at the end of her keynote. How can we teach mathematics so that people stop killing each other? It's something that I've sort of faintly thought about before then, but this really puts it front and center for me at the time. It's something that I've continued to think about and answer in different ways. And since I don't want to rob you of the experience of seeking your own responses, I won't share my thoughts on this. So we can certainly overlay mathematical structures, relationships, patterns onto real societal issues, but really the execution is the important part, because ultimately real world does not necessarily or automatically mean engagement. I would be remiss not to link back to the notion of identities as we talk about power. Due to the complex historical baggage that we all carry, there's certainly perceived identities that enter the room before a student even has a chance to be someone for themselves. This is where it's really important for us to check our own privileges, inherent biases, and recognizing that since it's impossible for us to eliminate our own biases, we need to reflect on them. This also relates to how students present or share their ideas during their conversations with each other or with us. Through what lens do we actually judge how sophisticated the students' responses are? What does sophisticated even mean? And these assumptions, on the one hand, certain racialized students are assumed to be bad at math. And on the other hand, other racialized students are assumed to be good at math. Wherever on that spectrum, our interpretations, our actions, our supports, prompts, hints are all influenced by these biases sort of subconsciously. And these all ultimately impact the way that we engage them in assessment processes. Through a series of sort of circumstances, I was involved in the writing of the new grade 9 curriculum here in Ontario. The following link here is just something that we wrote related to assessment and culturally responsive pedagogy. Something I want to point out is that we really emphasize educator bias as something that readily exists. It's not a debate or a question of whether or not bias exists, but it's more about taking that as a starting point and then moving forward from there. As a final example that I'm going to share, I will share an exchange that I had with Amelia. Amelia is a mathematics teacher with a lot more years of experience than me. She's been an instructional coach. We've often been involved together in PD. And so through my journey of teaching at different schools, at one point I was teaching at a school that she also taught at. So during, I think, a lesson study or just after school one day, I was talking about specific students and I was describing where these students are at, their conversations with each other that prompted those assumptions, and so on and so forth. And she shared with me that she has students in the class that she doesn't know much about. And she asked me how she might change that. So another thing to know about me is that I don't really hold on to information that I don't deem important. So usually like I have a hard time pinpointing specific turning points in my life or in my career, because I see everything as sort of holistic, gradual, and complex. And so it's really hard for me to isolate specific epiphanies that are responsible for specific things. My wife tells me that this is why I never remember things like even my own birthday, or that it takes me like a good 10 seconds to remember like what I had for dinner last night. And this is really considering that I love food. So in any case, Amelia asked me how she can capture information about students that she seemed to know very little about, like if clarity or of mental picture meant that she means how well we know how a student is at or where they're going, then there were these students that were just kind of fuzzy. She asked what I typically do, and so I couldn't pinpoint specifically how I came to do what I did, because everything, like I said, is sort of gradual and complex for me. But since this was right after I finished my thesis, I basically framed my response right away in the context of the assessment process. I might not have said the word assessment at the time, because we all know that words come with baggage, and differing interpretations and definitions of assessment leads to a different discussion than the one that I wanted to have. So I shared that I typically have the fuzzy students in mind after every day. And each day I'm intentionally planning for opportunities where I saw that these fuzzy students might have a bit more success with mathematics, or with being in the classroom, or with themselves as capable mathematicians based on what I saw that day. So if a student couldn't solve a problem with their peers, or felt that they couldn't contribute, but based on what I saw, they were really quite good at producing helpful representations, then I would design an activity for the next day or frame it in a way where the fuzzy students might have more success, because then maybe the problem is best approached through something that they saw themselves being good at. So I was going to mention something else, but because I'm a little short, I'm just going to head towards the end here. So really it comes down to a couple of recaps and thoughts here. So assessment functions need to be fluid to empower. The humanness of assessment is not only inevitable, but it is also an asset. All assessment is responsive. The question is more about who, how, when, and why. Assessment is power-laden and relational. And with great power comes great responsibility. And then lastly, empowerment is for student, but it also is for us teachers, because this process also grants us more ability and flexibility to confidently support students where they're at, without relying on the beautified black box made of percentages and weighted values. It's a lot for sure. So especially because there's lots more questions than there are answers. But to finish off, I'm going to quote Mr. Dwayne Johnson in terms of how we can best approach all this responsibility. It's about drive. It's about power. We stay hungry. We devour. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jimmy. Wow. I hope that gave everybody as much to think about as it gave me. We're gonna have time to engage with Jimmy after we've gone off into our groups to discuss and think about these things. The groups have been created. I'm going to open them up in a minute. So whether you're wanting to go into a group that wants to talk about outcomes-based assessment or competencies, keep in mind the ideas that Jimmy gave us today, to think about our conversation through the lens of power and the lens of empowerment. And I think the most important piece is this idea of being human and humanizing assessment. So I'm going to open up the rooms. I'll pause the recording. You'll have about 20-ish, 25 minutes out there, and then we'll bring you back, and then we can do Q&A with Jimmy. All right, so you can self-select into the groups. There is also a group on assessment and power/empowerment. I had to be creative with the title because you only get so many characters for. Welcome back, everybody. Are we here? All right. I hope the conversations that you were having were, oh, everyone's frozen, which means I'm frozen. No?
I hear you.
You hear me? Okay,
Sound
good.
frozen.
All right. When everybody on the screen freezes, then it's usually me. There we go. I think the system is sort of recalibrating here. Anyway, I hope you had really productive conversations within your group, and in that, feel free. Like, one of the things that has started to happen is by meeting with the same people once in a while, you can start to, you're allowed to connect with each other outside of this series. You're allowed to reach out and contact each other and continue conversations outside of this. This is really what we want to happen here. But now we open up the floor for questions for Jimmy.
Come up with an estimation of the unemployment rate. So that's the activity, and we're going to work through.
Somebody needs to mute.
Yeah, I'm working on it.
Unemployment rate is an interesting question, though.
I don't think that question was for you. Does anybody have? I know Mark has a question for Jimmy.
I do. I can start with that if we want to kick off some thinking. I don't think I could articulate as well as you did, Peter, in our group, but you talk about the influence or the impact of of students in their space and what happens when you enter that space and the influences that and the dynamics and all the different things that come into play there. And so I was just wondering about what goes into how do you enter that safe place and still to be able to have the effect that you're hoping for, to be able to still observe what you want to, like be both visible and invisible at the same time. Just curious as to what you sort of picked up along the way as you've been conscious and aware of, wow, this is a space that I am entering.
Yeah. So a couple of things. First, this was something that I was thinking about before I was engaging in attempting to build a thinking classroom. And this was what in the beginning, my students were working in groups, and they were sitting in groups, and then the teacher would come as this sort of imposing presence that is taller than everyone because they're standing. And even though I'm not super tall, I am taller when they're sitting. And so it was something that I was conscious of, because they speak differently, they think differently, and they almost look at you for every other word sometimes. It wasn't really until like that I was actively building a thinking classroom after meeting Peter in 2014 that I really started to navigate how my own solutions work. And I'm emphasizing my own solutions because I don't think it will always work for everyone. I don't think there's a silver bullet for that. But the first thing is we can't avoid it. We're going to have a presence. We are nonetheless going to be in positions of authority, of power, even no matter how we shrug it off or try to shrug it off, it's going to be there. But I found that I have become less visible. I don't know how to describe it, but like I would just kind of move around, and sometimes they would just be completely shocked that I was there listening to them. Like they would like startle, which, you know, it also has to do with the task. So again, like I think that the answer to this is quite complex because it has to do with, you know, the level of engagement, how much they're invested in the problem that they're doing, and how much they don't care about you. Like they'll tell me to shut up sometimes. I literally, this is still a joke I have in the present classroom this year. Like I literally had a student tell me to shut up, but they didn't realize it was me, which is even funnier. Because they were talking about something and he was really compassionate about what he was saying. And then I asked a question, and to him, it was like, it was almost like a snarky question. Like I didn't need to ask that question, but I asked it because I thought it was fun. I don't remember what it was anymore. But then he said, shut up. And then he turned around, and then the other students were shocked because they saw it was me, but he didn't. And then we had fun about it, and we still joke about it. But anyway, so I think everyone's solution is going to be a little different. For me, I think it's a little easier for me to hide and be invisible because I'm physically shorter, and I try not to say a lot. But I still do recognize that I do still change the conversation. So I'm not blind to that. And so I think that's something that we can't completely erase. We can't erase our presence, and we have to be okay with that. And we have to just be aware that it's going to be different when I hear a group from sort of like 10 feet away, and I'm trying to listen to their conversation from the middle or from the side or from the corner, versus me physically being in there, like in between the three people, or like, blocking them from the board or something. But I think that is where it's like little things, little gestures, little things you say over time with the students, that the little nuances of the relationships and the positionality you have built with them, that kind of shapes it. And I think it's going to be different not only from teacher to teacher, but it's also going to be different from student to student, and group to group. I mean, certainly I render myself invisible to the student that was shocked and, tell me to shut up. But I wouldn't be with students that are, coming into the classroom with a lot of, I guess, baggage of being, feeling inferior in mathematics, and they would be very conscious of anyone coming close to their space as they're trying to do something. So, I think it's something you have to feel out almost per student, but also for yourself. I don't know if that's a helpful enough answer.
Yeah.
I can't speak for Mark, but I thought that was like one of the things I've observed when I spend time in classrooms is when you observe students from afar, they communicate with each other at their register. So they have that sort of student-centric way of talking to each other. They use a certain vocabulary and so on. And when you come closer, they try to elevate their register to what they think you want to hear. And I think that disrupts it. So one of the things that I try to do is when I enter a group, I try to use some of the vocabulary that they use to try to get them to talk in their register with me rather than talk in my register with me. Anyway, other questions for Jimmy? Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Jimmy, thanks for sharing. One thing that I noticed, and I agreed with what you said, is you mentioned how who is assessing needs to be considered. And by who you mean not just who the person is, but what day of the week that person is assessing, or what time of the day, or different things that may come into play that can affect assessment. I'm just wondering if you have any strategies that you have put into play that have allowed you to kind of mitigate those impacts on assessment.
Yeah, Well, the first thing that comes to mind is have more data.
Yeah.
I think that helps a lot, because that helps mitigate the sort of potential biases that come into play, or how you're heard on a particular day, or how your presence affects, you know, a group in a particular format. I think having more information helps. And I think the kinds of the kinds of information that you attempt to gather also helps. And I think a lot of the times, I think especially, you know, even before, when I start talking to others about observations and conversations, which I deemed ephemeral forms of assessment, ones that are fleeting in my writings, and people ask about, like, how can you have so many at a time? Like, how do you keep track of all of them? I always respond that you don't need all of them. I see it as more opportunistic. In the other group, we were just talking about like some of how to deal with that. Like, but I wouldn't try to force a particular interaction, because I feel that it's sort of it changes our frame of mind, our sort of orientation towards what I'm listening to or what they're talking about. And so the very first priority for me, for the most part, most of the time, is that I want to commit myself to listening and actually listening to them, and then responding to them in a way that supports them, as opposed to an evaluative mindset where, you know, now I'm really exercising my power and determining the arbiter of what's right or wrong, and you know, noting that down over time. I think a lot of the times I end up having actual moments where I feel like, okay, I need to write this down. If it's like students that I haven't seen really demonstrating a particular understanding, and then in those moments that I've heard, I go, oh, hey, that's something I've never seen from them before or heard from them before, that actually indicates a level of understanding that I had not had before. And so that those moments I would note down. That's why I call it opportunistic, because it's purely based on chance that I would hear that through their activities. And of course, you can set up particular situations as well that are intentional. So if you know particular students really benefit, you know, from having those conversations because they really cannot produce in a similar way in their writings, then you are really, you know, offering them more of those opportunities over time. And I would say, like, the end of it is just like, over time, you're going to be better at it with the students. I'm not saying over time in the teaching career. I'm saying in the school year, over time with a particular group, you'll learn the students better, and you'll have better relationships with them, and you have a better understanding as to, yeah, okay, these couple of students really benefit from me listening intentionally, maybe asking them some questions, and then these other ones maybe don't. Not that they wouldn't benefit, but more that, you know, we only have one person. Does that help a little bit?
Anybody else? So Roz is typing something in the chat here that you can maybe pick up.
Yeah. It takes so much time in relationship building to shift the dynamic from performing that. Right, exactly. I completely agree. And this is related to what I was saying about shifting. The paradigm shift can't just be for us teachers. Like, you know, when Shepard's talking about paradigm shift, they mean like in general, but really the things that matter for us are the shifts in the classroom. And we're going to have to do that basically from now until the end of time, because I think what we have traditionally is very set in its place. So yeah, yeah, I agree.
Anybody else?
I had one more question, but I'll wait because I've already gone. I'll see if anybody else has one first.
I had one. One of your last quotes you did, you said the humanness of assessment is not only inevitable, but also an asset. So I was just curious, like, what are the asset aspects that you see of that?
Yeah, I think what I was trying to allude to is that the humanness offers us flexibility. Like I'm not leaning on percentage weightings or you know the black box as I call it, or I guess as Dylan William called it. I am relying on that, you know, relational aspect, that presence aspect, that us being present aspect of assessment, and that in itself is human, and that in itself creates sort of an almost freedom in us being able to truly listen to students and you know be with them where they are, you know, back to the actual Latin root of assessment, acidere, which means sit beside and with, as opposed to having, okay, I must have 20% of this kid's work for this particular competency in this particular way, and then I must have, you know, we sort of alleviate ourselves and free ourselves of those must-haves when we see assessment itself as being human. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Mark, did you want to throw your question in there?
Sure. I was just curious. You mentioned looking back and how you kind of look at things holistically, and it's hard to find those big moments of change. But I was curious about looking ahead. You know, what are sort of the things that you're feeling right now? It's like, you know, this still just doesn't feel like I'm there yet, and that's something I want to pursue and try to figure out. What's sort of rubbing you right now?
Yeah, that's a great question, because, you know, I asked lots of questions, though. I didn't actually say a lot of questions that I have been thinking about, and I think about lots of them. The main one, the main, I guess, categories of questions that I'm really thinking about or wrestling with are ones surrounding identity. So I'm interested in eventually, at some point when life becomes less crazy, pursuing maybe a PhD on thinking about the idea of identity and how it relates to the assessment process. You know, the ways that it detracts from it or supports it, or you know, of course, the definition of identity as, you know, all of what I said. So the building of the structures for which students are playing in, the paying attention to what they're thinking about, like that entire relational process. Like I really want to dig deeper into what does that actually mean in terms of supporting students' mathematical identity and agency, and I want to further explore and think about you know, what are the circumstances or the different moves, under what conditions, for which students, for students with particular experiences, if I had them before, if I haven't had them before, if they had positive experiences, but they were positive experiences a very specific way, like they were marks-oriented positive experiences. They've always got 99s, 100s, but they had a very particular view of mathematics, and they saw themselves as being successful in that. And so therefore, maybe it tends them not to want to think about mathematics in a different way. Like how can the assessment process, how could the assessment process, and how do the assessment process actually influence those kind of continuous constructions of identity? Because I see identity as not something that is set in place, but, you know, dynamic and ever changing. So that's sort of the biggest thing that's front to mind. And so in my own readings, actually before COVID and before this craziness where I have basically no time to do anything, I was reading a lot about identities. I was reading a lot about affect. I was reading a lot about, you know, different areas that I can read about that sort of touches on this idea, not necessarily in mathematics education, but just in general. So yes, that's one of the things that I've been thinking about.
And I think this ties into one of the things you said in your presentation was, how often do we as teachers impose an identity on a student before they've even had an opportunity to establish one for themselves, right?
Mhm.
And that's something really to think about. Anybody else? While you're thinking, in case you're curious about what Jimmy looks like in his classroom, because he kept saying, there you go. So
Yeah,
Jimmy,
that was what, 2015 or 2017? Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember that day because Judy and I were in your classroom, and the number of times that we lost track of you in the lesson.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it is true what I said. I do tend to disappear.
Have you ever had the phenomenon of a teacher coming into your room looking for you? And
oh, yes, many times. And they would come in. I see them at the door and I go, are they actually looking for me, or is it something I can wait till later?
Yeah.
And they probably don't need me right now. So I just let them leave. And then afterwards, they'll come back to say, hey, I dropped by your class, but you weren't there. And be like, no, I was there. I saw you. You came with this piece of paper and blah, blah, blah. But yeah, it's funny sometimes. It helps, but sometimes when there are issues, it's not helpful. So I mean, everything I think comes with it's not so much a dichotomy where things are good or things are bad. I think there's pros and cons to being or the ability of invisibility. I think there are pros and cons there, and that's why I said why I emphasized for Mark's question back in the very first question, that I think everyone needs to find their own way of entering spaces. And mine seems to be invisibility, so that works well.
We got time for one last question if anybody has one.
Visibility is a power, and with great power.
That's right.
All right. Well, I just want to take a moment to just say a huge thank you to Jimmy for joining us, especially in this time of sleeplessness from center of Ottawa.
Ah, yes.
And you've certainly given us lots to think with and think about. And you're welcome to join us at any of these sessions in the future. And we'd love to have you among us, whether we notice you or not.
How often, just out of curiosity, this year might be a little crazy, but how often do you meet? To just curious, because I am very interested in assessment, and this seems to be all about assessment. So I'm in my place with my people right here. So
yeah, we meet twice a day, Jimmy.
then that's impossible. Yeah, or maybe I'll turn you on right when people are honking.
Yeah. So the history of this group, and for people who aren't aware of that, at the BCMT Fall Conference in 2020, I did a presentation on assessment, and there was a huge number of people who wanted to keep the conversation going afterwards. So we started out as this sort of monthly thing of just meeting and having conversations, always with a guest presenter, let's say, sharing out some ideas, and then opportunities to engage with them and engage with each other. And it's morphed and evolved a little bit, but I think we're all just in that space where we know that our assessment practice is imperfect, but we're all working towards trying to find a path forward, however that way that looks. And we're fortunate enough to live in a province where they give us a fair bit of latitude around assessment through their, what I call delicious ambiguity of assessment mandates. But so we're all on a journey trying to find our way forward, and it's a journey I think will never end. But yeah, we meet about once a month, but we avoid months with holidays in them, like spring break and stuff like that. Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks for the invitation. I think I'll definitely take a look at my calendar and see if April 13th will work. Hopefully, the March break will be actually, well, first of all, that actually happens. And then hopefully it'll be restful.
Yeah. All right, everybody. I'm going to turn the recording off. I think that